Welcome to this third episode of the Best Hopes podcast. My name is Adam Thrower.
I'm Cecil Walker.
And today we're going to take just a little bit of a step back. We have, over the first season, we kind of took several different, what we call slices of hope, and we kind of considered them individually. And in this episode, one of the things that we want to do is now consider kind of all of these characteristics of hope, or these avenues of hope, and put them into a context where they kind of relate to one another. I guess make sense of them as a whole. And anything else you want to add about like the premise of where we're going here?
Where have we been already, or where we're planning to go next?
Either, whichever one you want.
Well, I guess the larger idea is really trying to paint a full picture of not only what hope is, but what hope does and how its presence seems to be quite large and impactful for all of us. So yeah, that's all I would add, is that we were just kind of going at it from all these angles because we're trying to get the fullness of the spectrum of here's how it exists, here's how it kind of pervades into our lives, and here's why that could be a really useful, constructive thing if we're more intentional about it.
Good. Yeah, I think that's true. So I think the first step in the stepping back is to say, what do we know as far as research goes, or the theories go around hope? And one of the things that I would say is that Charles Snyder is, for all intents and purposes, the father of hope. He's the one that developed hope theory. Most of the research, most of the things where academics talk about hope, reference hope, it always points back to Snyder and to kind of his theory of hope. So I think we would be probably missing a huge chunk if we never referred to his theory.
Okay.
Since you're like an expert in all things hope at this point, could you just give like a brief overview of what Snyder says? like what is hope theory according to Snyder?
Well, I don't remember the word for word, textbook definition that he would give, but he laid out these components to what hope is, and that's kind of where all of the hope research has branched from. These basic components. And in a vague definition, he kind of established that hope was just our belief in our ability to achieve the thing that we are wanting to achieve somewhere in the future. And I think a more specific definition, the research seems to really have taken hold onto a more specific three components of having a goal, obviously a future-oriented one, and having some awareness or exploration of the pathways to achieving those goals, and then seeing yourself as containing the capacity or the agency to walk one of those paths towards that goal. So that's a more, I think, specific and component-based kind of definition of that bigger definition that I gave. But all in all, there's something in the future that I want. There's a way to get to that thing, and I think that I'm capable of that. And that is, in its essence, hope. And so all the research that's come from that has been analyzing these different components, as well as looking at, what differences it makes when these different components are there or not. And I think I even saw some things in the research about how that seems to lend itself well to common factors, even, if hope is an important thing in therapy, if that's a common factor that seems to make a difference in lots of different therapeutic approaches, then what's going on that facilitates hope and makes that something that can begin to have an effect for clients. But I'm getting away from what you originally asked.
No, I think that was a really good description. I think like holding on to those three components of like there is a goal in mind, there is pathway thinking, and there is agency thinking. Those are kind of the three components that come back over and over and over as you think about hope theory, especially Snyder's hope theory. It seems like most people who are looking at hope now kind of just build on that foundation. I think one other component that I might just add in there is one of the things that he talked about in his hope theory is that hope is a state.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is an important component because he then said, if hope is a state, in essence, it always exists. There always is hope. You could have little hope or you could have a lot of hope, but you can't have no hope because hope is the state. Just like we live in an environment where oxygen is the state. We could have a little oxygen, maybe we're at the top of a high mountain, or we could have a lot of mountain, maybe we're in a low valley, but we can't have no oxygen or else the state ends. We no longer are in the state of living. And so that same idea of hope is that hope is therefore always present. It just depends on how much or how little hope is present. And then he also developed a couple of measures to measure hope. And a lot of that measuring, again, is how clear are you on the goal? How much pathway thinking can you come up with? How much agency do you feel like you have in order to move toward these things? And so then that's how he measured how much or how little hope was present. But in essence says you can't have zero hope. Do we leave anything else out as far as Snyder goes?
No, I think that captures it pretty well. And again, I think that's the foundation of pretty much all writing about this in a more formal academic kind of way. And it those basic components very much, that's ground level for this stuff.
Yeah. So then that then leads us into, we have considered hope, especially in the first season. And if you haven't listened to the first season, you might want to go back and listen to the first season because a lot of what we're going to talk about today is based on each of the episodes from the first season. But we considered hope in an entirely different avenue than Snyder's hope theory. We talked about kind of all of these different components of hope, different aspects of hope, where you might see hope, what implications there are for these different avenues. Maybe since I get to ask a lot of questions today, this just happens to be my turn to ask questions.
Next time it's my turn.
But as you think back on why we did what we did in season 1 and why we didn't even try at all to align it with Snyder's hope theory, what rationale do you have? What explanation do you have? If academia is set up on hope theory according to Snyder, why didn't we do that?
You're basically asking, explain myself for why we've had this whole podcast going in the first place.
Yes, please. Tell me why we have this podcast.
A lot of reasons come to mind. I think academic writing and research is confined to what it's confined to. One, they do have to build on what, research comes before. Mm-hmm. So if someone wants to do research on hope, they look to, what has been said about hope already. And so that's why they're kind of stuck in I have to branch off of what came before. But also they have to find some way to make this observable, make this something I can measure and talk about in a concrete way, which I don't think we're necessarily confined to. And I think it's also it's specific from the point they even begin to explore things in that they're trying to capture psychological concepts and make a science, here's, something you could put in a textbook and put into basic components and say, here, learn this, observe this, know this thing. And I think we were kind of doing the opposite. We are looking at, here's how this thing is so fluid and everywhere and everything. It's hard to put into just one tiny container or to say it's one basic couple of things. And in fact, I think our first season could have gone on indefinitely. We could have kept slicing more and more and more. And we even talked about that in some of the episodes, how we were I can't believe we have 30 more minutes of something to say about another form of hope or another way that hope kind of shows up. So it's clearly just a very everywhere in all kinds of shapes and forms kind of a thing. And I would also add that I don't think that we're declining or defying this Snyder-based kind of understanding of hope. If anything, I think we're seeing something bigger that just includes that's a corner of a larger picture of hope. There's more dimensions to it or more area to it than just that very specific 3-component kind of thing. So like I said, I think there's probably lots of different explanations. I'm just throwing out a couple of reasons why.
Yeah, I think that's actually really helpful. I really liked the explanation of like, that's a really worthwhile corner. But hopefully this is going to like expand a bit on that, not detract from his theory, his thoughts and all. And so I think that then launches us into one of the things that we did is that we considered 15 different components of hope, or 15 different aspects of hope. And just as a reminder, for those of you who maybe haven't spent a lot of time in season 1 for a while, I'm just going to run down the 15 things, and I'm going to put them in a different order than we put them in when we were talking about them. Because when we were talking about them in season 1, we very much, it was like this inductive process that we were going through. And as we would consider a new one, we would just tack it on to the end. We weren't trying to make sense of how do these 15 components fit together. And since season 1, we spent quite a bit of time kind of mulling over these 15 aspects and kind of trying to say, how do they fit? How do they work together? How do they hold together as a complete picture? So as a reference, I'm going to say we have now broken these 15 things kind of into 2 different categories. Really 4 different categories, but the categories overlap a bit. So I'll start with 2. We talked about a set that fit into internal qualities or characteristics or traits. And then we talked about a set that falls into external things. So these would be potentially internal to me as an individual and external to me as an individual. So the internal qualities, slices of hope from season 1, we said awaiting is something I do internally. Dependence, encouragement, rumination, virtue, belief, desire, and faith. So 8 of the qualities we said are internal qualities. Those are things that I can have. I can have dependence internally. I can ruminate internally. If I have hope that's virtuous, that's coming from inside of me. A belief, a desire, faith, those are all internal components of hope. Anything you want to say about that kind of grouping first before I jump over and say what's in the other group?
Not specifically. I will say it was much harder than I would expect to put these
torturous almost
into categories because it doesn't feel obvious. But I think that speaks to what we were saying earlier, just about how fluid apparently this is, how it's not one simple little thing. Apparently hope is up and it's big and it's kind of messy and everywhere.
True. All of those things are true. So, yeah, and maybe in a minute we can talk about like that messiness and how we tried to like pull it apart a bit. Yeah. But if I then go to external qualities, and this is where it kind of feels a bit vague, but we put ambition there, opportunities, intention, anticipation, dreams, and expectations. Now, that's only 6. There were 8 in the first, 6 in the second. That obviously only equals 14. There was 1 additional, which we said doesn't quite fit into either of those categories. And that was purpose. Purpose could be something internal. I have purpose. I feel like I have an identity that is purpose-driven. Or it could be external, that my purpose in living is outside of me. So 6 external, 8 internal, with 1 that kind of bridges over both. Anything you want to say so far?
I would reiterate that how difficult it was to be able to put these into these different categories. But I think what's also interesting now that anyone listening has heard of the internal ones, the external ones, and then that outlier in purpose, I think it starts to help actually really tell us a lot potentially about hope, because all of these words came directly from the definition of hope. These words are synonyms. They're like, transmutations almost of what hope is and how it shows up and all that. And so I think it's really fascinating and enlightening how some of those words very obviously fall into an internal or external category. Like opportunities feels like, yeah, of course, that's like out there. The action of this form of hope seems to be somehow taking place outside of, some internal thing. And then some feel like, oh, that's a bit vaguer, that I'm not totally sure if that's really internal, that's external. And so for these words that come directly from hope to feel like they can fit in different ways, different amounts of certainty in these different categories, I think that again reinforces how fluid hope is and how many different shapes and forms and angles it kind of has to it, and in the ways that it shows up into people's lives. But I don't think any of us would disagree that, hope does show up in these things. All of them touch on hope and are an extension of hope, yet somehow they're all apparently very different.
Yeah, I think that's true. I really liked the way you described that. And just for reference, we have a list of the 15 characteristics of hope with various synonyms that we talked about again in season 1. We'll make sure to put that in the show notes. Yeah. But we also have a couple of charts, tables that show how we divided these things up. Those will also go into the show notes. So that will help you to kind of visualize what it is that we're talking about here. But one of the things that I think is really valuable, and just know there's a second table that'll come in a minute that kind of overlaps with the ones that we talked about here. But just this first table, just this idea of internal versus external, when we compare that to Schneider's hope theory, I think it's really important to kind of lay that on there. And I can see in some sense how it might easily lay on top, right? Agency thinking might correspond to a lot of those internal things. There's something about me that has the ability to make these choices, to make this movement, to move in this direction. It's a self-driven thing. I can see how some of these external things might be pathways of like, I might need to dream, or I might need to pursue this particular opportunity. And so I can see how external things might fall onto some of that pathway thinking. But I think that what you just described also is that this is a really expansive thing. We don't necessarily have to have hope in a particular goal or a particular destination that we're going. That a lot of these components of hope, things like it's a virtue, right? That isn't necessarily movement oriented at all. It could just be that I live a particular way because I hope that this is going to be good for the surroundings. This is going to be good for the community. This is going to be good for the people around me who I love. It's not necessarily like movement toward any goal, nor is it that I have to like pursue this pathway to achieving virtue. It might just be that I think about what's important to me, what I value, and I hope to live in accordance with that value. So I make choices, I make decisions to be consistent, to be, to live according to my belief system or to the rules that I've set for myself or the parameters with which I want to live. And so I think, and similarly, like this idea of rumination, right? Rumination might be like the thoughts that I have. It's all this brain work. It's this idea, just like stewing over something. Again, it may not be a destination oriented process. It might just be, I'm trying to make sense of something here. I hope that by stewing over this, clarity will come or understanding will come. And I can see that Schneider might say, well, that is the goal. Like clarity or understanding could be the goal. But I could also see I'm okay with ambiguity. I'm okay with not necessarily knowing the answer, but I'm just trying to make sense of something. I'm just trying to stew over something. I'm just trying to make sense of what's going on. And so in considering all of these different components of hope, I can absolutely see how they might fit on and apply to Schneider's theory, but I can also see how they might not, how they, like you mentioned before, might broaden that theory a bit, which I think is really worthwhile to think about and consider.
Yeah, then that leads me to wonder. Oh, I get to ask you a question.
I should have kept going.
No, it makes me wonder then, so what's the advantage to our more expansive, mapping of what hope is versus this, let's just take it as these simple 3 components. This is just hope. Just look at the pathways, like that's all it is.
I think there might be several advantages, but I think one of the easy advantages is, I guess the way that I'll describe it is this. I have become more and more interested in, and I value a lot more, work that centers on identity. And I think that Schneider's theory, in some sense, is always the pursuit of something. And I think that can be very worthwhile. The goal could be to become more aligned with my identity or to understand my identity, and so I don't want to discount that in any way. But I also think there's always the pursuit, like I'm always aiming at it. I'm always moving toward it without the acknowledgement of maybe I've got it. Maybe there are components of my identity. Maybe there are whole swaths of my identity that I feel pleased with. And I think in an environment, the other component that I really have kind of come to value and really think quite a lot about is this idea of well-being. I think oftentimes when we're in the continual pursuit, right, it's almost like the rat race. I could never rest. I can never let down. I always have to be going. I always have to be pursuing. I always have to. And I think there's real value in saying, perhaps this is good enough. Perhaps I look at some of these words of like belief. I'm not sure that belief has to be something that I have to change or that I have to be pursuing or that I have to. We could say belief is something that if I just hold true to this belief or I do things according to this belief for my whole life, that could be sufficient. I don't necessarily need to think about new pathways of how to live this belief. I don't need to necessarily think about like agency of like, how am I going to, believe more? Now, again, I can hear the counter argument of like, well, agency thinking is like, how do I align my way of being with this belief more and more? I think maybe that's really valuable, but I think there's something inherently great, positive about just having a belief and acknowledging that belief is sufficient. I think where that's worthwhile. I think, again, looking at some of these things around purpose, right? The one that bridges both internal, external. If I'm satisfied with my purpose, if I feel like I understand what it is, I want to live according to this purpose, and that never changes, that might be sufficient. And so I think one of the things with Schneider's hope theory is that it perpetuates, which I think on the one hand is great, and it should. And lots of these terms like dependence and ambition and opportunity, and you can hear how that might fit beautifully. But I think there are some that don't have to. And so again, I think it's this broader perspective of, I might be okay just the way I am.
Good. It's a good thing I asked that question. I think it brought us somewhere valuable. I think being able to I 100% agree with all of those things, that there is clearly so much that is valuable that could potentially get lost or minimized in this more specific and concrete kind of a, targeted way of understanding hope. But I think it distracted us. It's not, you were going to take us somewhere else with the other charts.
Yeah, and I think actually that it ties really nicely because another comparison that we did side by side was, and I think this helps answer your question as well. So much of Snyder's theory is like future oriented. What is the goal? How are you going to move toward the goal? How are you? And we looked at these 15 components and we said some of those things really align with that. And we called it future tense, right? That these are things that will happen in the future. These are things that we're constantly moving toward. Things like, and we put several into that category of the future tense. One, ambition, opportunities, intention, anticipation, dreams, expectations, and purpose. These kind of future things that I'm going to be moving toward. But then as we kind of really stewed over it, and again, I don't think we can like exaggerate how much time we spent, hours like mulling over, where do these fit? We realize that there are some that often are talked about as present tense things. Things that are happening in the moment, and they serve a purpose for this moment. There's value in just being present tense, being sitting here in the moment. And I think about, the whole Buddhist principles and teachings of like, just be in this moment, appreciate this moment. You don't have to be thinking about the future. You don't have to be anticipating. You don't have to be planning. You don't have to be thinking about the past or regretting the past or belaboring the past or any of this. You can simply be in this moment. And I think there's something very hopeful about that, about there's goodness, there's pleasantness, there's value in just this particular moment. So we call this other set the present tense synonyms. And these are await, dependence, encouragement, rumination, virtue, belief, desire, and faith. So again, 8 in the present tense, 7 in the future tense. It's almost divided 50-50. And I think that distinction of like, I can have hope. I can be filled with hope. Hope can be really playing a part in my life. And that's a present tense thing that I think sometimes gets lost in Schneider's conceptualization of hope. Does that help answer where you were hoping we were going to go?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And I think it just shows, and again, the expansiveness, the depth to this, the plurality of dimensions to hope, that we could go in this other kind of a direction with it and say, oh, there's even a difference between the effect of it or the action of it happening present versus it happening in a future sense. And not to give us more hours of thinking to do, but I also am just curious about like, well, are there other ways we can continue? I assume this possible. There probably are. Not that we have to go find them, but are there other ways of like saying like, along this dimension, are some of them this and some of them that? Is it always of this or that thing, or is it multiple categories? Sometimes you're thinking about it in a certain kind of a way. I don't know. I'm just like throwing that out, that maybe there are these other ways, but that just again reiterates, how big this is.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I hope maybe people who are smarter than me, probably not as smart as you, but we try, like as we were stewing over that, we tried slicing these in different directions. We talked about like qualities that we have versus things that we do, right? Like dreaming fit into what we do. Encouragement fell into something that we do, but it started to break down a bit after time. And so we were like, maybe that's not quite it. Another distinction that I've thought about before is some of them are nouns, right? I have belief, I have faith, it's a virtue. They're these nouns, and some of them are verbs of like, I dream, I anticipate, I await. So again, I think maybe there's something in there too. But one of the things that I love about like these different divisions, a couple things I love about it. One is that we are meaning-making beings, and we make meaning, I think, even of the concept of hope by languaging it. And we now have these 15 really elaborated descriptions of hope.
Yeah.
And now on top of those 15 elaborate descriptions, we have 2 different sets of categories. We have present tense. Hope can be present right this moment. Hope can be focused on the future. We have categories of how we can utilize hope. And I think when we can language it in that way, it helps us to harness it. I, before all of this, never thought about hope as a virtue of like, I can be hopeful. I can be a hopeful person, and that's going to add virtue to my life. And so now that I have the language for that, then I get to make meaning of it. How do I want to hopefully be virtuous or virtuously be hopeful? I don't know which one comes first, but I have new language that I can apply to this concept of hope. In addition, we have like this internal versus external. And I think one of the things that's really beautiful about that distinction is that we're relational beings and we should relate to each other through a place of hope. But unless I am a hopeful person internally, unless I kind of harness what hope is for me personally, I can't bring that to a relationship. I can't contribute that to who we are as a relationship. And so again, I think the language and these categories with these beautiful descriptions, it helps us then to be purposeful, to say, how do I want to embody hope? How do I want hope to fill me? How do I want to let hope kind of emanate out of me and impact other people around me? And so now when we have the language, we can also, and again, I think this goes back to Schneider's theory, we can then use our agency in order to utilize it to its fullest potential. And so I don't think that that's the same way that Schneider was using agency of like, now I can move down a particular path. But I think that idea of agency, it allows me to say, how do I want to let hope grow? How do I want to let hope impact other people?
Yeah, I think that's brilliant because I mean, that even answers that earlier question of what's the advantage of us doing this and expanding on this and even going into all of these specifics, these different angles that we go into, all these different slices, because something is being created through this exploration. And it very much makes me think of like, every book we could read, every inspiring story we can come across, every movie we watch, all these things. The message of all of these different things aren't necessarily new messages or something that we would have just, that is so brand new. No one has believed in it or agreed with that before this person did this thing or said this thing. It's things that I think most people, I mean, you think of any good, inspiring movie, it's always about, love prospers and, you should be good and do the right thing and keep believing and working hard. Like, it's always like very, very understandable things that we all can say, yes, I believe in that already. But I think the difference that's being made and the reason that these things are so powerful is that they're putting it into new language. They're showing us a new way of implementing that or a new understanding of here's how this can exist in the world. And that is extending the utility of that, but also just our understanding of how meaningful and how powerful those things can be. So I think exactly what you're saying is very, very true. It's like this exploration is giving new language and thus giving new ways of utilizing this, new ways of seeing it in our own lives or even beginning to use it in our own lives. And I think that is a potentially very, impactful thing that we can start to begin to use. I mean, even like you're saying, in our own conversations, it can have impacts on us that we've been able to formulate these conversations and put these things together and now begin to look at ourselves, our lives, so people that we come in contact with in potentially different ways.
Yeah, I think one of the final things, I guess, that I would say is one of the things I really do value about Snyder's theory is that it is a state.
Right.
And I think when you look at like these 15 components of hope, it drives that home even more. Like, there's no way all 15 of these could be absent.
Yeah.
If you think about that context of there's present tense hope and there's future focused hope. If I don't have future focused hope, then there must be some present hope. If I don't have some present hope, then there must be some future hope. If I don't have internal hope, then there must be some external hope. And so I think, again, this language and these categorizations, not just these 15 components, but making sense of them, helps to really reiterate it would be impossible for hope to be absent. And so I guess that's where I would say that in and of itself is hope building. Because if you all of a sudden feel hopeless for whatever reason, which I know lots of people will say, like, I feel hopeless, or I've been in this place where I've been hopeless before. One of the things that it makes me then trust in is that we should be able to find at least one of these somewhere. Even if somebody is saying, like, this is the worst it's ever been, I can't look forward and think it's going to get better than this. Well, they might have taken 7 of the possibilities off the table, but there are still 8 more that are like, but where do they sit inside of you? Or where is hope present? And we do solution-focused therapy, and one of the things that we always say is, if they are sitting in our office, if they're sitting on Zoom talking to us, that in and of itself is evidence of, I'm hoping something will be different. I took action. I moved in a way to get here because I thought this would have an impact. That might be, I'm awaiting for something different. That might be, I have belief that this could make a difference. So maybe 13 of the 15 are absent, but I can say they're waiting for something. They're waiting for something to happen. They believe coming here could make a difference. I can immediately say there are at least 2 aspects of hope that are present. And so I don't think that can be understated of, with all of this language, with all of these components of hope, it would be impossible to get rid of them all.
Yeah, I think that is a potentially really illuminating way of looking at this, that if there's something constant about it, and that it's some force of nature that just, has to exist in some capacity. I mean, it reminds me of that's how in science they talk about heat, that there is no such thing as cold, because it's either more or less heat, and you can never have a total absence of heat. It's just a lot less heat, maybe. And even in extremely, what we would feel are cold temperatures, it's just that the heat is very little. And I think that's maybe where people find themselves, feeling like I'm hopeless, or there's a lack of these things. But what it really is there's maybe what feels like a deficiency of those things. I have much less than what might be ideal, what I might prefer. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a presence of those things at all, or even the potential for an expansion of those things. And I liked how you kind of like implied this balance of things where we might be looking at a deficiency in one direction, kind of inherently means there must be something in another direction. If I'm looking over here and seeing there isn't faith, there isn't, one category or some section of this hope here, that means there must be something somewhere else. If I'm not looking at the future, I must be looking at the present, maybe even the past. If I'm not, facing one thing and not seeing anything, then that must be that, in some other direction I'm not looking in, must be the presence of this thing that could really make a difference. And if I were to oversimplify therapy, I think it's exactly that. It's just like, move your flashlight over a little bit. Look at that stuff right there. At least solution-focused therapy that we do. And so clearly that can make a difference, because clearly in there, it makes a difference for people.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. I think hopefully that was a good explanation of how we do align with Schneider a bit, but how we hope this might also expand on what he was talking about. Any final things that you want to make sure to add?
I think we actually got a lot in relatively short time.
True. Well, one of the things that I would say is, as you look over the charts again in the show notes, as you look over the list of topics, if you can think of things that we maybe haven't thought about, please send us a message and let us know. Because again, we talked about, like, there might be different ways to slice this, and we would love to hear what your thoughts are as using one of these synonyms of rumination. As you ruminate over all of this, it's going to change how you see things. It's going to change how you view things, and hopefully we get to benefit from all of your ruminations.
Absolutely.
But in addition, if you think of anybody who could benefit from considering hope in this expanded way, please feel free to share this podcast with them. That would mean a lot to us. in the meantime, go be hopeful.